Uh, Hi, my name is Luke. I'm a sophomore film student. I'm currently sitting in my drab, awful basement in Detroit, Michigan. And I'm here to talk about a film, a movie, a piece of art that I really love. Even though it just recently came into my life, has genuinely very deeply affected me. And it's kind of a weird movie to do so. Now, being a film student, you learn a lot about what should be put into a film to make a film objectively of quality. What makes something look good? What kind of techniques should you apply in certain areas? Just basic, not really rules, but guidelines. It's just filmmaking fundamentals. But it can start to feel restrictive when you're perhaps just getting introduced to the world of film. I mean, there are textbooks written about it. It can feel like there's a way you're supposed to make movies. So something that really affects me as a filmmaker is when I see a film take those general conventions and just turns them inside out and wears the rules as like a funny hat. And that's why I'm talking today about Nobuhiko Obayashi's 1977 cult classic horror film, Hausu. This was Nobuhiko Obayashi's directorial debut, his first feature-length film. He also wrote it with the help of his, I think, 9-year-old daughter. To call this film experimental, especially for a film that got a wide release, in Japan at least, is kind of a fucking understatement. This film is insane. It's insane. It's gotta be one of the most chaotic feature-length films ever put to the big screen. It makes no sense. It's difficult to follow in some ways. It's hideous looking, and also I fucking love it. And every time I watch it, I become further convinced that it is just one of my favorite films of all time. So I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the story of the film, the actual plot. I will say first off that the plot is certainly not the most interesting thing about the film, especially on a first watch, where perhaps pieces of the plot can get lost in the weirdness. But the plot itself is actually, by horror film standards, extremely generic. A group of young girls go on a summer vacation trip to a old semi-abandoned house in the countryside and quickly learn that everything is perhaps not as it seems in said house. My favorite thing about this script is probably how they wrote the characters, because they kind of cheated. The protagonist, like the kind of main girl's name, is Gorgeous because she's pretty, and her 6 friends that she brings along with her all have names that align directly with their personalities. Like there's a smart one named Prof, one who daydreams named Fantasy, and another one, the best one, named Kung Fu, who does kung fu multiple times throughout the film. Some of the best scenes in the movie. So there are these like kind of paper cutout characters. They certainly don't provide a lot of depth. Not all of them get that much screen time, but the way that they decided to go about making the characters is just, it's adorable, it's funny, and I get how it might seem lazy, I guess, but the film makes it clear that it knows it's being silly. Now, there are some themes involved with the plot that I'll talk about a little more later. They make it so that the plot is extremely heavy-handed and yet way overly subtle at the exact same time. There are themes and ideas in this film that are straight up blink and you'll miss it. There are things I didn't even notice in the film until after I listened to the director himself talk about it. Okay, God, where do I even start on the visual aspect of this film? If you choose to watch it, which I obviously highly recommend, I'm confident you will find that it is one of the most visually challenging films you will ever see. It is nothing short of chaos. It's not like you can't tell what's going on if you're paying attention, but the way they decided to present the film, it's mind-boggling. The movie will just jarringly cut between stop motion, normal live action, hand-drawn onto film animation, from obviously painted backgrounds to large, beautiful, real-life landscapes. It doesn't even always look good. Like, sometimes it looks genuinely, like, bad and unfinished, but it's like they meant for it to look bad. You could say that the movie lacks visual cohesion, and you would be right, but it still doesn't take away from it somehow. It all adds up to this glorious mess. And in some interviews and accounts on the film, they'll say that they wanted it to look like as though a child made it, or as if the film was the product of a child. But regardless, like, you just don't even care that it looks fake. It's fascinating and it's funny, and the visuals themselves are just funny and off-putting, and they really take your guard down, which is wild because they made this film without a single storyboard. Like, they built whole sets. They built an entire house, as far as I'm aware, of sets, and they didn't storyboard a single thing. They just showed up on the day of with the actors and a camera and were like, all right, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be making some whack shit. It blows my mind. What the fuck am I even going to film school for? This motherfucker is in the Criterion Collection, and you just showed up for this feature-length, studio-funded film with no idea what it was gonna fucking look like? It's just incredible that the movie feels like one movie when it does so many different things, and sometimes only once and for a very short amount of time. Oh god, the production of this film is fascinating, which is a decent segue into the soundtrack, my favorite movie soundtrack ever. If you were to listen to the soundtrack, there is no way in a million years, if you didn't know what the soundtrack was, that you would think it was the soundtrack for a horror film. There's like practically nothing in the soundtrack that would suggest that it belongs anywhere near the horror genre. It's full of light, plucky, and fun songs, pop songs, written by a Japanese band called Godaigo. And it's one of the most lighthearted, fun, instrumentally interesting. The biggest the widest gap in genres on any single soundtrack that maybe I've ever heard, maybe on any single album that I've ever heard, because it'll go from light, plucky, kind of electronic piano music, and in the next song be an all-out, full American blues track, sung in English by a man in a raspy voice. And then there's just straight up pop singles in there. The soundtrack is truly as insane as the movie, and if you were to experience them separately, you would wonder how they could ever come together. But they do. And one thing that's interesting about it is that the soundtrack was actually assembled, produced, and sold in stores over a year before the film even began production. The soundtrack was made well in advance of the film. I don't even know if the script had been written. The director, in order to get the actors kind of in the mood of a scene, would just play the soundtrack for the film on the set of the film, which, if you don't know about film, the soundtrack is generally made and applied after the film is complete or is nearing completion. Generally, you would base your soundtrack on the content of the film, but this film is like the complete opposite. And on top of that, it has one of the most insane movie soundtracks ever recorded. Also, there's a theme song to this film that gets played throughout the film like 30 times. Way too many times does the same single music track get used. And then there are whole 9-minute tracks on the soundtrack that go almost completely unused throughout the film. And this one song gets used over and over until it's absolutely locked into your brain forever after only seeing it one time. And I loved that song. It started to annoy me when it was when they used it for the 5th time, but by the 20th time I was jamming. Highly recommend it, looking into the soundtrack. So, just from the clips I've showed and the explanation I tried my best to give, I don't know if I was really trying to teach anyone about the film as much as I was just trying to do my best to express how much I loved it. If you didn't learn anything from this video except how much I love this movie, then mission accomplished, because that was really all I was looking out to do. It's absolutely one of my favorite films of all time. I'm going to be watching it pretty consistently for the rest of my life, and sharing it with as many people are willing to watch it. So please, if you have not seen this film, please watch it. Even if you hate it, you will never ever forget it. I promise you, you will never forget this movie. This film is something that you will at least be able to talk about for the rest of your life, because it's just that special. Which brings me into the final portion of this video, and a big part of the reason that I'm even talking about this. Nobuhiko Obayashi was born on January 3rd, 1938 in the province of Hiroshima, Japan. His father was a doctor in the Second World War, and he spent most of his early years raised by his grandparents. Throughout his early life, he was a writer, an artist, and a musician. And in his late teens, he began preparing for medical school after his father urged him to, but ultimately decided to abandon a life of medicine to pursue his passions in the arts. He began making experimental films in the latter half of his college years. Some of his films would see a decent amount of viewership and actual distribution. Out of college, he entered the world of television commercials, where his experimental and eclectic style followed him. He made very strange, wacky, and interesting television commercials in Japan, and today he is considered one of the fathers of modern Japanese TV commercials. And if you know anything about modern Japanese TV commercials, they're fucking weird. And then in 1976, the Toho production company would take a chance on Obayashi, giving him his first feature-length directorial film, being Hausu. And so began a film career that spanned over 40 years, saw wide critical acclaim. Throughout much of his filmography, Obayashi tried to convey anti-war messages. Specifically, many of his stories have a through line that involves World War II. Obayashi was 7 years old when the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan. Many of his childhood friends being killed in those bombings. Now, I don't feel like I have to explain that those bombings were a big deal. He felt even 70 years after the bombs were dropped, there was damage dealt to the Japanese psyche that is still relevant to this day. His second most recent feature film, called Hanagatami, is directly about this. Themes can even be seen in Hausu, which at first glance would seem to have nothing to do with World War II. Obayashi felt that the generations that followed the atomic bombing, as well as people in other parts of the world, will never truly have an understanding of what it was like when those things happened. And he devoted much of his filmography and his life to kind of bridging that gap. And he did so without ever talking down to them or belittling people for not understanding. And he did so with a smile on his face and an extremely unique eye for film. Nobuhiko Obayashi died of terminal lung cancer on April 10th, 2020. After being diagnosed and given only a few months to live all the way back in 2016, Obayashi would go on to direct 2 more feature-length films before dying at his home in Tokyo just last week. And Obayashi himself and the career that he had, God, they just make me want to figure out what kind of artist I am and just be that artist until the day that I die. Obayashi proved to me that something can be goofy, scary, and imperfect and still be beautiful. Thanks for watching this. I hope it's not too long. I wonder how long it is. Oh god.